Hi everyone, my name is Krista, and today myself and my three group members are going to be analyzing food insecurity among university students. For our presentation, we will start with an introduction of the concept of food security, then move on to discuss the barriers that university students experience that contribute to their food insecurity. We will then analyze the negative impacts on students' well-being, then a discussion on the concept of intersectionality in relation to food insecurity, and finally, we will end our presentation with a discussion of some policy recommendations to improve food availability for university students. We will first begin with our introduction to a couple important concepts. Firstly, food security is defined as a situation that exists when all people, at all times, have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. As we proceed through this presentation, it will become clear how this access to complete food security among university students is in many ways unachievable. University students are highly susceptible to food insecurity for many reasons.
And next, we're going to discuss barriers to food insecurity among university students. There are several barriers to food security among university students, and the most common barriers among undergraduate students is the cost of food, tuition fees, rising housing costs, and time management. First, research has found that the cost of food can lead to unbalanced diets. The most common form of unbalanced diet among students is low level intake of fruits and vegetables. As these foods are more expensive, students often turn to eating out more frequently and purchasing highly processed foods. As student meal plan prices are rising, students are struggling to eat nutritious food. This can lead to skipping meals and purchasing food on campus, which is often an unhealthy option. To help hungry students, several universities and colleges across Canada have opened pantries and food banks for in-need students. Housing costs are also a barrier to food insecurity. As housing costs rise, student housing has become unaffordable for many students. And the last barrier to food security is time. Time management is a large factor for students as we are often busy with schoolwork, part-time jobs, and our social life. The busy school schedule of a university student allows little time to prepare healthy meals and go grocery shopping. Drew Thorne completed a study to assess student food insecurity of 5 Canadian universities. The study concluded that food insecurity is a crucial issue for university students in Canada. Results found that 2 in 5 students in the study experienced some form of food insecurity. Some students faced food insecurity to a higher degree, and these group of students include Aboriginal and racialized peoples, off-campus dwellers, and students that primarily fund their education through government assistance. The results found 3 main barriers to food insecurity among university students. First, the cost of food. Second, the tuition costs. And third, housing costs. As the cost of tuition and student housing continues to rise, food insecurity among university students will continue to be an important health, social, and economic issue.
Now we will examine some of the impacts associated with food insecurity among university students. First, research has found that a student's state of mental health is often negatively impacted as a result of experiencing food insecurity. Some common experiences include anxiety and preoccupation with food, inadequate quality of food, and an insufficient amount or quantity of food available, thus resulting in feelings of alienation. The inability to access food in socially acceptable ways was associated with a deep sense of failure, characterized by feelings of shame, frustration, and aloneness. As a result, students often feel socially isolated and personally responsible for their vulnerability. Physical health in one's diet is often impacted as a result of suffering from food insecurity as well. In a recent study of 5 Canadian universities, Meal Exchange suggested that 1 in 4 food insecure students' physical health are significantly affected by food insecurity, while 49.5% of students have to sacrifice buying healthy food in order to pay for essential expenses such as rent, tuition, and textbooks. Furthermore, 1/3 of university students are also experiencing limited access to traditional and cultural foods as a result of food insecurity. Students who are food insecure are also more likely to have their academic performance suffer. As such, students often experience poor academic outcomes, including lower grade point averages and difficulties concentrating at school in comparison to food secure students. Many food insecure students often describe their food-related costs as discretionary expenses in their budget, while tuition and rent are described as their fixed priority expenses. Students also commonly describe healthy eating as a luxury that cannot be afforded as a student, and there's an underlying notion that food insecurity is simply a norm in student life. Quote one student mentioned was that they're familiar with the idea of starving students, but if you're in school, you don't have money. The student life is not known as a healthy food life. These perceptions suggest that students have normalized their experience of food insecurity as a student's rite of passage and thus are reluctant to reach out for support. Next, food insecure students are often dissatisfied with the university due to the lack of affordable, healthy food options on campus and feel they're being taken advantage of, as well as identified purchasing food on campus as the last resort. Research has also shown that students express resentment toward food services, quoting, "The economics are way off. They know that if we don't have a choice, we're just going to buy it anyway." As a result, many students are simply forced to skip lunch while they're on campus. Finally, the current coping mechanisms university students are turning to are lacking because of stigma, which has been identified as a major barrier to seek support. As a result, students' responses and attempts to cope with and manage food insecurity are often powering through or acceptance. Many students believe their current situation was temporary, so they just had to power through knowing there's a better life after university, while others simply try to avoid spending time thinking about it and often identify a lack of power or control of their experience with food insecurity.
Next, we're going to look at the one thing that affects all of the social divisions in society when it comes to food insecurity, which is our economic system. Instances of food insecurity strongly correlate with a lack of financial stability, so it's prudent that we look at what affects economic inequality. Since the introduction of neoliberalism to our society, economic inequality has rapidly increased within our nation as well as across many countries. This trend is evident in the past 30 years, where the discrepancies in wealth are not evenly distributed in society, but rather we find higher rates of low-income households and poverty among marginalized groups, such as racial minorities and non-citizens. But since we're limited on time, we'll only look at how neoliberalism affects food insecurity through the commodification of food and the commodification of higher education. With neoliberalism came the focus on economic gain through the free market above all. The combination resulting in globalization, industrial food system, and international trade has led to the commodification of our food. This is best exemplified by terms such as cash crops or commodity crops. Furthermore, the government subsidizes certain crops over others, and which has created cost discrepancies between processed foods and healthy, nutrient-dense food, leaving students with little choice when it comes to their food. In the neoliberal world, no longer is higher education seen as social good with intrinsic value, but instead, it has been reconceptualized as a commodity that a student purchases for his or her own gain. With that, academic capitalism is definitely a part of neoliberal free market methodologies. Higher education has begun to operate as a business whose focus is to increase revenue, which has led to a dramatic 40% increase in tuition fees. And Canadian financial support for students is inadequate for ensuring food security during university. So academic capitalism and insufficient financial aid, along with the commodification of our food, has led to the inability to secure nutritious food that meets our dietary needs for an active and healthy lifestyle, creating the breeding ground for food insecurity among students. And despite these macro level systemic obstacles to food insecurity, our research still shows that students largely blame their circumstances on poor choices and budgeting skills. Reaching out for help is associated with shame and guilt. The food insecurity that accompanies higher education is seen as the student's burden to bear, their way for paying their cost for success in a supposedly meritocratic society.
In the next section, we will discuss a few policy recommendations that can be put in place to improve food availability and access for students, and a few ways in which COVID has contributed to the improvement of food security. In order to address the issue of food insecurity among university students, the following policies should be implemented: a food and housing survey for university and college students in Canada, a commitment to reducing barriers for Aboriginal and racialized peoples, and a local program for university students to receive adequate housing and meals. Furthermore, before the COVID-19 pandemic, food insecurity was already an increasing issue among university students, and during the pandemic, many students have lost their jobs and their access to on-campus food services, which has made this problem even worse. Universities and colleges have done a decent job at providing students with emergency task forces, new funds, beefed up wellness programs, housing options, care packages, and more. However, in order to ensure that these quick short-term solutions have lasting effects, universities must understand that food insecurity was an issue long before the pandemic hit, and in order to combat these issues, certain policies such as these need to be implemented for longer periods of time.
So in conclusion, food insecurity is a prevalent issue among university students that can no longer be ignored. The barriers found to food security include the cost of food, as well as costs associated with getting a higher education, including housing and tuition, with great impacts on the mental health of students, their physical health, as well as their academic performance. We must address the underlying systemic obstacles that neoliberalism poses on food security through policy recommendations, including implementing food and housing survey, commitment to reduce barriers, and creating local programs. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation.